During the absolute chaos of World War II, a government made a desperate choice. They decided to unleash one of nature's most powerful forces, not just against an invading army, but against their own people. This is the incredible story of how China weaponized the Yellow River.
Imagine seeing this. This is the scene that greeted American journalist Theodore White when he arrived in China's Henan province in 1942, a place of just absolute horror, where dogs, as he wrote, were slipping back to their wolf kinship. So how on earth did things get this bad? Well, here's the thing. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was a calculated, deliberate act of war.
You see, this whole catastrophe wasn't some tragic accident. No, it was a strategy, a plan to turn the environment itself into a weapon of war.
Okay, so let's set the scene. By the spring of 1938, China's nationalist government was, frankly, on the ropes. Japan's modern mechanized army had just swept through the north. The capital city, Nanjing, had already fallen. And now Japanese forces were closing in on two absolutely critical cities, the railway hub of Zhengzhou and the temporary capital, Wuhan. The conventional war was being lost, and it was being lost fast.
So, unable to stop Japan's tanks and trucks with their own soldiers, the government turned to a really unconventional strategy. They decided they were going to weaponize nature itself.
Their target? The Yellow River. For centuries, it had been called China's sorrow because of its absolutely devastating floods. And the plan was brutally simple. Dynamite the southern dikes at a place called Huayankou. The idea was to unleash a torrent of water and, just as importantly, silt right across the plains and into the path of the advancing Japanese army. Now, the goal wasn't really to drown the enemy. It was to create a massive, muddy quagmire that would literally swallow their tanks and artillery, grinding their advance to a halt.
And here's the crazy part. The strategy actually worked. It halted the Japanese advance for months. But the cost? Well, the cost was a catastrophic, man-made disaster on an unimaginable scale.
In the immediate aftermath, an estimated 1.2 million people were displaced from their homes. I mean, just let that number sink in for a second. A flood, created by their own government, suddenly made over 1 million of its citizens homeless refugees in their own country.
An official report from the time, well, it describes the scene as the water just surged across villages and farmland. People were stranded on rooftops, in trees, or simply swept away. The report ends with this chillingly simple summary. It was utterly horrible.
But that initial flood was just the beginning. It set off this horrifying chain reaction. First, the flood zone became a sort of permanent swampy wetland. Then, when a drought hit in 1941, these drying wetlands became the absolute perfect breeding ground for locusts. By 1942, a plague of locusts was devouring what little food was left. So, when the Japanese attacked again in 1944, years of flood, famine, and pestilence had left the region completely unable to resist.
Now, to really understand what happened here, we have to look at it through a slightly different lens. Because this wasn't just a story about military tactics or even human suffering. At its absolute core, this was a violent, desperate competition for energy.
There's this idea called the ecology of war, and what it does is it reframes conflict, not just as battles and armies, but as a struggle over the essential resources that fuel a society. It's a competition that completely rewires the relationship between people and the land they live on.
When you strip everything else away, that's what war is. It's a battle for energy. And in Henan, that battle was fought for control of food, fuel, and yeah, even the river itself.
This battle for energy took a whole bunch of different forms. You had food, right? The grain needed to feed both soldiers and civilians. You had fuel, things like wood and reeds in a land that had already been heavily deforested. You had human labor, for fighting, for building. And finally, you had the raw power of the river, a force the Chinese called shuishi, that both sides were desperately trying to control and use as a weapon.
This whole situation created what historians now call military macro-parasitism.
It's a bit of a mouthful, but the idea is that the 500,000 nationalist soldiers in Henan basically acted like a giant parasite on the civilian population. They were demanding food, labor, and resources from the very same people who were already starving.
And here you can see the result in black and white. Look at these grain prices. In less than a year, they exploded by more than 25 times. With the army demanding its share through heavy taxes, a devastating famine wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. There was simply no energy left for the people.
So, after 8 long years, the landscape was a total wasteland. But the story doesn't end with destruction. What came next was an absolutely incredible effort of human reconstruction.
This quote from a refugee just captures the challenge perfectly. The floods had left behind these thick layers of silt that, when the sun baked them dry, turned the earth into something like concrete. Most people had fled. The land was considered uninhabitable. I mean, where do you even begin to bring that back to life?
Well, the scale of the recovery was just staggering. Take a look at these numbers from Fugo County. In 1945, it was almost empty. Barely anyone left. Yet by 1952, it was actually more populated and had more farmland than before the disaster ever happened. It just goes to show the monumental human energy that was poured into reclaiming that land.
But even a recovery as remarkable as that couldn't erase everything. The war left deep, lasting ecological scars on the landscape.
You see, the war caused widespread deforestation and severe soil degradation. This created these lasting vulnerabilities in the ecosystem. So fast forward to the 1950s, when China launched the Great Leap Forward. This wounded ecosystem was just less resilient. The loss of forests made sandstorms worse, and the damaged river systems couldn't handle the new policies, which just made the next disaster even more catastrophic.
And this really reveals a fundamental truth. The environmental changes caused by war don't just disappear when the fighting stops. They create weak points, vulnerabilities in the landscape that can last for generations, shaping future events in ways you'd never expect.
Which, of course, leaves us with one final big question. We tend to think of wars ending with treaties and armistices, right? But if a war physically reshapes the Earth, if it alters whole ecosystems and changes the very soil beneath our feet, does it ever truly end?